The archive was old, older than the conclave itself. Its walls were made of pale stone that had not seen natural light in 400 years, and the air inside smelled of dust and something that had no name in any living language. Velshan liked it here. He liked the quiet. He liked the way the past sat still and let you study it without arguing back. He was a Thuron, tall and thin with 6 long fingers on each hand and eyes that caught light the way water does, always shifting, never quite settled. His kind were known across the conclave as scholars and record keepers. They did not fight, they did not govern. They remembered, and in the conclave, that was considered enough. He had been in the archive for 3 days, without sleeping. This was not unusual for him. The terminal in front of him was displaying a star map, very old. She pulled from a data core that had been sealed for 2 centuries. Most of the star systems on the map were familiar. Conclave worlds, allied systems, trade routes marked in faded gold. But there was one region out near the edge of the galactic arm that had no name on any current map. It was simply blank, not the blankness of unexplored space, but the blankness of something that had been removed. Someone had taken the name out. Velshan leaned closer. He zoomed in on the region layer by layer, pulling up older and older versions of the same map. The further back he went, the more detail appeared: trade designation, codes, population markers, communication, relay positions, and finally, in a map that was nearly 500 years old, a designation label appeared in the center of the blank region, counted red. Human occupied space. He sat back in his chair and stared at the words for a long time. He had heard of humans, of course. Every scholar had. They were mentioned in pre-conclave records the way old sailors used to mention sea monsters, with a mixture of genuine fear and the quiet hope that none of it was really true. The conclave did not talk about them in polite conversation. In classrooms they were covered in a single paragraph: an ancient species, dangerous, self-destructive, gone. The paragraph always ended the same way. They destroyed themselves, it was said, quickly, like ripping off a bandage. Then the lesson moved on. But Velshan had never been satisfied with that paragraph. He was a scholar. He did not like paragraphs. He liked primary sources. He began to dig. What he found over the next 3 days was not a clean story. It was fragments, pieces of records that had survived deletion, translated communications from other species who had observed humans from a distance, partial logs from alien ships that had passed through the edge of human space and come back changed. Some had not come back at all. The picture that assembled itself from these pieces was strange and difficult. Humans had not been one thing. That was the first surprise. They had been many things at once, split into hundreds of separate groups they called nations, each with its own rules and leaders and beliefs. These groups had fought each other constantly, terribly, with weapons that scared even species who had been making war for 10,000 years. They had burned their own cities. They had poisoned their own oceans. They had killed each other in numbers. That made Velshan feel physically sick when he read the figures. And then somehow they had stopped, or at least slowed. A coalition formed, not peaceful, never quite peaceful, but functional enough to reach the stars. What they found in the stars, they claimed quickly, aggressively, not through war necessarily, though war was always present as an option we're willing to use, mostly through speed. Humans move faster than other species expected. They built faster, traveled faster, made decisions faster. One old Duran military observer had written in a report that was now 600 years old. They do not pause to consider whether a thing is possible. They simply begin doing it and adjust as they go. This is deeply unsettling to watch. Belshun read that line 3 times. Cerna, the records grew sparse after a certain point, around 300 years ago, and then stopped entirely. There were no distress signals, no goodbye transmissions, no evidence of a catastrophic war or plague, or any of the usual endings that species met when they reached too far and burned out. Humans had simply gone quiet, their calm relays had stopped transmitting, their border stations had gone dark, the stars they had settled sat silent. The conclave had concluded they were gone. The official record said so. Most scholars had accepted it because the alternative, that an entire species capable of that level of aggression and ingenuity had simply decided to stop communicating, was too strange to sit with comfortably. Belshun was starting to think the alternative was exactly what had happened, and he saved everything he had found, encrypted it, and was about to start on a second layer of the archive when a sound came from the corridor. Outside, boots on stone fast. A young assistant pushed open the archive door, breathing hard. She was Duran, thick-limbed and gray-skinned, built like a small fortress, which made her obvious distress even more alarming. Archivist Belshun, she said, Council is requesting all senior scholars. There has been an incident. He looked at her. What kind of incident? She hesitated. Station 7 on the outer reach. It stopped responding 6 hours ago. Belshun closed his terminal slowly. One station losing contact is not unusual. It's not one station, she said. It's 3, all in the same sector, all within the last 12 hours. And the approach vector of whatever caused it. She stopped, swallowed. Council says it is moving toward the core systems. Belshun stood. He was already thinking about the star map, about the blank region at the edge of the galactic arm, about a species that had gone silent 300 years ago and left no explanation. He gathered his notes and followed the assistant out of the archive. The council chamber on Conclave Prime was enormous, designed to hold representatives of all 11-member species at once, with space for their interpreters and guards and the various atmospheric requirements they each needed to survive. Tonight only half the seats were filled. The representatives who were present looked like they had been pulled from sleep. High Commander Orth stood at the center of the room in full armor, which he almost never wore indoors. That alone told Belshun more than anything the council had said so far. Orth was Duran. He was wide and heavy, and had survived 3 wars and 2 assassination attempts, and had not visibly aged in 20 years. He was not the kind of creature who wore armor indoors. Out of habit, he wore it when he thought he might need it soon. The signal analysis is complete, Orth said. His voice was flat and controlled, the voice of someone who was choosing each word before it left his mouth. Whatever is moving through the outer reach is large, very large. The mass signature suggests a fleet, not a patrol group, not a survey team. Fleet. Our best estimate is somewhere between 300 and 500 individual ships. The room was very quiet. Ambassador Seal of the Luvari species raised one hand. She was smaller than most of the others in the room, pale and softly luminous, her bioluminescent patterns flickering in the blue rain that our species used when they were frightened and trying to hide it. Has there been any communication, any identification signal? None, Orth said. They are not broadcasting. They are not responding to our hails. They are simply moving. Then we don't know who they are. Seal said. We have some information, Orth said. He gestured and a holographic image appeared above the council table. A scan of one of the destroyed border stations, or rather, what remained of it, which was not much. The station had not been damaged or disabled. It had been erased. The metal had been liquefied and scattered, and the communications equipment had been vaporized. There was no wreckage. Really, just a smear where something used to be. Several council members made sounds that did not translate well, but communicated distress in every language. This is not a style of attack any of us recognize, Orth said. The energy signature of the weapon used is outside our current catalogs. We are working to analyze it. Belshan looked at the image. He thought about the records he had spent 3 days reading. He thought about a line from a Luvari diplomatic observer writing about a human military engagement 500 years ago. The damage they inflict does not look like damage. It looks like the target was never there. He raised his hand. High Commander, do we know the origin point of the fleet or the direction it came from? Orth looked at him. We do. It came from the outer arm, Sector 12. Approaching from the south. Belshan pulled up his personal data pad and looked at the star map he had been studying 3 hours ago. Sector 12, the south approach of the outer arm, the blank region, the place where the name had been removed, human-occupied space. He did not say this out loud. He was a scholar. He knew that saying something too soon without enough evidence was how good research became bad rumor. He closed the data pad and listened to the rest of the briefing, but his hands were not entirely steady. Later, when the briefing was over and the council members were filing out in small, quiet groups, Belshan stayed behind. He stood at the holographic display and looked at the scan of the destroyed station for a long time. Then he looked at the trajectory map, the projected path of the incoming fleet drawn in a thin red line across the star chart. It passed directly through the region he had been studying, directly through human-occupied space. He did not think the fleet was human. The weapon signature did not match anything in the human records. The silence was wrong. Humans had been loud, historically aggressive communicators. They had announced themselves. They had argued and broadcast and transmitted. Whatever was coming was not announcing itself, but the direction it came from, the path it had taken. That was interesting, because there was only one reason a fleet that large would come from that specific region of space. Either there was nothing there, and they had simply passed through it, or there had been something there, and now there wasn't. Belshan went back to the archive. He pulled up every record he had found about humans and started reading again, this time looking for something specific. He was looking for any account, any fragment, any single line from any source that described what humans did when something attacked them. He found many such accounts, he read, until the lights in the archive cycled to their low setting, indicating that it was the middle of the night. He read until his eyes ached and his throat was dry. He did not find anything that made him feel better. He found one fragment from a Keth trade observer who had watched a human military engagement from a safe distance that stayed with him longer than the rest. The observer had been writing about the end of a battle, describing the aftermath, trying to explain to their superiors why the human side had won a fight that all analysis said they should have lost. The observer had written, "They do not stop. We do not understand why they do not stop. Most species, when the cost becomes too high, choose a different path. These ones do not seem to calculate cost in the same way. They seem to calculate only whether the thing they are fighting for is still exists. As long as it does, they continue. I do not know what to do with this information." Velshaw read that line 5 times. Then he closed his terminal, sat in the dark archive, and thought about the blank space on the star map and the fleet that had come from it, and what 300 years of silence might actually mean. He thought about it for a very long time. The Conclave warships moved out toward the outer region formation. 43 vessels of various sizes organized into 3 groups. High Commander Orath's flagship led the center group. It was called the Durance Fist, which told you most of what you needed to know about how Orath thought about military naming conventions. Velshaw was not on the Durance Fist. He was back on Conclave Prime in the archive with emergency access to databases he had never been allowed to open before. The Council had granted it reluctantly, after he had spent 2 hours explaining carefully with footnotes why, understanding what had existed in that blank region of space might be important, before sending 43 ships toward it. And the Council member who had finally approved his access request had said in a tone that suggested they were not entirely sure they were making a good decision. Find out what you can, archivist, and find it quickly. Velshaw had bowed and gone directly back to the archive. The fleet that was approaching them had a name by the second day. One of the Conclave's long-range sensor drones had gotten close enough to photograph a ship hull before it was destroyed, and the markings on the hull matched a designation in a pre-Conclave military database. The Vrath Dominion. Velshaw found the entry quickly. He read it twice to make sure he understood it, because the first time through he thought he must have misread something. The Vrath Dominion had been operating for 62 years. In that time, Monet had encountered 32 distinct intelligent species. Of those 32, 29 had been absorbed. The 3 that had not been absorbed had been destroyed. Absorbed was the word the database used. Velshaw looked up the definition in the Vrath's own records, which had been translated by a Conclave linguistics team some 40 years ago, and then apparently filed away and never looked at again. What absorption meant in Vrath terms was this: the target civilization's population was divided. Those who could be made useful, engineers, scientists, soldiers, were taken. The rest were removed. The planet's resources were stripped. Communication infrastructure was repurposed for Vrath use. Within 2 generations, there was no meaningful record that the original civilization had existed. 32 civilizations. Veltion sat with that number for a moment. Then he pulled up the Conclave's own military readiness reports and cross-referenced them with everything the drone data had shown about Vrath's ship capability. The picture was not encouraging. He was still sitting with that picture when his comm unit chimed. It was one of Vrath's staff officers on a relay from the Durance Fist. The officer was young and trying very hard to sound calm. Archivist Veltion, the High Commander, requests any information you have gathered. We are approaching the intercept zone. I am compiling it now, Veltion said. Tell the High Commander. He paused. He was a scholar. He did not tell military commanders what to do, but there was something in the data that he thought Orth needed to know before he did anything. Tell him to be careful. The Wraith weapon signatures are unlike anything in our active catalog. I am still analyzing them. There was a short silence on the other end. Understood, the officer said and ended the call. Veltion went back to his work. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted 11 minutes. Veltion was not watching it happen in real time, but the data came through fragments over the next few hours, pieced together from sensor relay stations and a few ships that had turned and run fast enough to survive. The forward column of the Conclave fleet, 12 ships, had engaged the Wraith vanguard at long range. Orth had followed standard doctrine. Spread the formation, draw fire. Identify weak points in the enemy line. There were no weak points. The Wraith did not have a standard defensive line. And they had something else entirely. Formation structure that adapted in real time, closing gaps the moment they appeared, redirecting fire in ways that suggested the fleet was operating as a single coordinated mind rather than a collection of individual ships and commanders. The 12 ships in the forward column were gone in 11 minutes, not damaged, not disabled, gone the way the border stations had been gone. There was a smear on the sensor data where they had been, and then the smear cleared and there was nothing. Orth pulled the rest of the fleet back. The Wraith did not pursue, not yet. They continued their approach at the same steady speed, neither faster nor slower than before, as though 11 Conclave warships were simply not a meaningful data point in whatever calculation they were running. Veltion read the after-action reports until late into the night. Then he stopped reading about the Vrath because there was nothing more he could learn from their records that would help, and he went back to the human records. He was looking for something specific now, and he found it in fragments spread across dozens of different sources. He was looking for what had existed in the blank region of space before the Vrath passed through it. Before the silence, what had the Vrath met out there at the edge of the arm 300 years of silence ago? The answer was incomplete, but it was there. The human territories had extended across 14 star systems at their peak. Not a small civilization, not large by galactic standards, but established, developed with shipyards and research stations and colonies on 9 worlds. They had been expanding steadily, not frantically, in the way of a species that was learning to pace itself after a history of doing everything too fast. And then the Vrath had come. Veltion found 3 fragmentary accounts of what had happened next, written by Vrath scouts whose reports had been captured or copied by some earlier Conclave intelligence operation, and then, like so many things, filed away and forgotten. The first account described initial contact. The Wrath had approached human space with their standard protocol. A fleet large enough to demonstrate superiority, a simple ultimatum, and an offer of integration, which was their word for absorption. They had done this 32 times before. It had worked 32 times before. The humans had not responded to the ultimatum. Instead, they had attacked. Not the main fleet, they had attacked the Wrath supply lines, their communication relays, their sensor buoy network, small, fast ships appearing in places the Wrath had not expected ships to be, doing damage and then disappearing before a response could be organized. The Wrath field commander had noted, in a tone that was clearly meant to be contemptuous but had something else underneath it, the primitives appear to believe that inconveniencing our logistics constitutes a military strategy. The second account, written 3 months later by a different commander, had a different tone entirely. The supply disruptions had not stopped, they had increased, and they had been joined by something worse. The humans had somehow acquired Wrath weapon schematics, not copied them exactly, but adapted them and modified them in ways that the Wrath engineers had not anticipated, producing variants that worked against Wrath shielding in ways the original design had not been capable of. The commander wrote, "They have reverse-engineered our own technology and made it more effective against us. This was not expected. We are revising our assessment of their technical capability." The third account was the shortest. It was from a senior Wrath military strategist, and it was dated 6 months after initial contact. Much of the text had been corrupted, but Velshan could read enough. The strategist wrote, "We have lost 9 ships to their weapons. We have lost 41 to their tactics. The primitives continue to engage despite casualties that any rational species would recognize as catastrophic. They are not behaving rationally. They are." The rest of the text was gone. Velshan sat back. He looked at the ceiling of the archive. He thought about what it meant that the Wrath, a species that had absorbed 32 civilizations without meaningful resistance, had lost 50 ships to a species that should by every analysis have been overwhelmed in weeks. Then he thought about something else. The silence. The 300 years of silence. If the Wrath had eventually won, if they had absorbed human space the same way they had absorbed everyone else, there would be records. The Wrath kept meticulous records of their absorptions. It was part of how they operated. He had checked. There were no records of human absorption, no population transfer logs, no resource extraction reports, no infrastructure repurposing documents, nothing. He opened a new document and began writing very quickly because his hands had started to shake slightly, and writing helped him focus. Hypothesis. The Wrath did not absorb human civilization. Outcome unknown. Possibilities. 1. Humans were destroyed with records suppressed, reason unclear. 2. Humans withdrew. To where? For what purpose? Unknown. 3. Something else happened that does not fit existing categories. He looked at what he had written. He deleted the third point, then added it back. He was a scholar. Unknown categories were not things you deleted just because they were uncomfortable. He saved the document and began to compose a transmission. It was directed at the coordinates of Human-occupied space. Old coordinates, 300 years out of date. The relay addresses of stations that might not exist anymore. Unlikely. He kept the message short. He used every frequency standard he could find in the human communication records. He used the old handshake protocols. He did not expect a reply. He sent it anyway because he was a scholar, and a scholar does not simply not ask a question because the answer seems unlikely. He filed the transmission as a low-priority outreach attempt because he did not want the council to see it and ask questions he was not yet ready to answer, and he went back to reading. Out in the dark between stars, a very long way from Conclave Prime, something was paying attention. It had been paying attention for some time. The Conclave's border stations going dark had not gone unnoticed. The movement of the Wrath fleet had not gone unnoticed. The destruction of 12 Conclave warships in 11 minutes had not gone unnoticed, yet the transmission from Velshan, low priority fragile, bouncing off dead relay stations, had been received on a frequency that no one in the Conclave currently active would have recognized because it was 300 years out of date, but someone had recognized it on the bridge of a ship whose hull markings were in a language the Conclave no longer spoke. A junior communications officer flagged the signal and passed it up the chain of command. It moved up quickly. Within 20 minutes it reached a woman sitting in a large chair in front of a very large window that showed a great deal of dark space and a scattering of stars. She read Velshan's message. Then she read the Wrath's approach vector data, which she had been looking at for 3 days already. Then she looked out the window for a while. Her name was Admiral Mara Osmensa, and she had known this day was coming for a long time. She turned to her first officer and said calmly, in a language the Conclave did not currently have on record, "Begin the fleet assembly, full formation. We move in 48 hours. The first officer nodded once and left the bridge at a pace that was not quite running. Osmensa looked out the window again. The Wrath fleet was several light days away, still moving toward the Conclave's core systems, still not broadcasting, still utterly certain of what was going to happen. She thought about what it had cost to build what was now assembling in the dark behind her. She thought about the 300 years of silence and what they had been used for. Once she thought about a very old saying that humans had from a very old time on a planet very far from here: speak softly and carry a big stick. The Conclave had been speaking. The Wrath had been speaking. She had been silent. She picked up her command tablet and began reviewing combat readiness reports, one ship at a time, all 412 of them. The Kiveth system was a good place to make a last stand if you had to make one. It had 3 planets, 2 of which were inhabited. It had a dense asteroid field on its eastern approach that could slow an incoming fleet down long enough to matter. It had a large orbital station that had been retrofitted in the past 2 weeks with every additional weapon the Conclave could mount on it. It was not enough. Every commander in the system knew it was not enough, and they were making the stand anyway because that was what you did when there was nowhere left to retreat. The Conclave defense fleet assembled at Kiveth numbered 61 ships, more than the 43 that had gone to the outer reach because the survivors had fallen back and regrouped, and because 3 allied species had contributed. Vessels, small ones mostly, fast patrol craft, that were better at running than fighting. Orith had accepted them gratefully and placed them at the rear of the formation, where they would be most useful if an evacuation became necessary. He did not say the word evacuation out loud, he thought it constantly. Ambassador Sihao was on the orbital station not because she wanted to be, but because the Council had asked her to coordinate civilian evacuation from Kivath's second planet, and she had agreed before fully thinking through what that would mean for her own safety. She had a staff of 12 and a communications board that had not stopped receiving distress signals for 6 days. She worked through them systematically, because that was the only thing she could do. One family at a time, one ship at a time. She had also written a document privately that she had not shown anyone. It was a formal request for terms from the Wraith Dominion, not a surrender technically, but an inquiry into the conclave's civilian population might be spared if resistance proved futile. She had worked on the language, carefully trying to thread a needle between dignified and desperate. She had not sent it. She kept finding reasons to wait one more hour, one more day. She was not sure if this was hope or cowardice, and she did not have time to figure out which. The Wraith fleet arrived at the edge of the Cabal system in the early morning. Cycle station time. The long-range sensors showed them first as a massive signature so large it looked like the scan equipment was malfunctioning. Then the detail resolved, and it was clearly not a malfunction. Fleet Master Corps stood on the bridge of his command vessel and looked at the Conclave's defense formation on his tactical display. He was Wraith, tall, pale, with a face that was very still and eyes that moved constantly, calculating. He had overseen 11 absorptions. He had a reputation for being thorough and fast. He prided himself on thoroughness and speed. They were, in his view, the two most important qualities in any military commander. 61 ships, his tactical officer reported. Mixed classes, Conclave primary fleet, plus allied auxiliary vessels, orbital station, moderate armament, significant civilian presence on the adjacent planet. Core nodded once. Signal approach formation. We will offer terms. First, this was standard Wraith procedure. You offered terms, they were refused. You demonstrated your firepower with a single strike on a non-essential target, then they were accepted. It was clean and it was efficient, and it had worked 32 times. Open a channel, he said. The channel opened. Core delivered the standard Vrath integration offer, the script he had delivered 11 times before, translated into the target species primary language by his communication systems. Why join the Dominion or be removed, contribute, or be erased? There was no third option. He closed the channel and waited. On the orbital station, Sihel heard the Vrath transmission at the same time as everyone else. She heard the language. Her translation system rendered it in flat, certain, without any tone that suggested the outcome was in question. It was not the voice of someone making an offer. It was the voice of someone stating a fact. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up the document she had written, the request for terms, and looked at it. She had put considerable work into the language. She had spent hours on it. She set it down without sending it. She did not know why exactly. Something about the Vrath transmission had made her unwilling. Perhaps it was the complete absence of any acknowledgement that she and her people were worth talking to as equals. Perhaps it was the 32 civilizations she knew about and could not stop thinking about. Perhaps it was simply that she was Lavari, and her species' deepest instinct under extreme fear was not submission. It was stillness. She sat still and waited and did not send the document. High Commander Orath did not respond to the Vrath transmission either, not because he had decided to hold out, but because he was looking at his tactical display and running numbers that didn't work. The Vrath fleet was not arranged in the formation he expected. It was not arranged in any formation he recognized from the tactical databases. It was something new, and he needed another 30 seconds to figure out what it meant before he started talking. He never got the 30 seconds. Every communication system on every conclave ship and station in the Cavit system activated at once, not because anyone had opened a channel, not because any signal had been sent through normal means. Something had come in on a frequency that the system's auto-response had recognized and engaged with before any operator could decide whether to allow it. The frequency was 300 years out of date. The voice that came through was human, though no one on the conclave side recognized it as such immediately, because none of them had ever heard a human voice before. It was deep and even and carried no particular emotion, were it the way that very calm water carries no particular current on its surface but may have significant movement beneath. This is Admiral Mara Osminsa, commanding officer of the United Earth Ship Unconquered Sun and attached fleet. We are transmitting on this frequency as a courtesy to any conclave systems that may still hold the old recognition protocols. We recognize we have not been in contact for some time. We apologize for the gap. There was a pause of about 2 seconds, which was not a long time in any objective sense, but felt very long to everyone listening. We are aware of the Wraith Dominion's current position and intended actions. We are aware of the Conclave's defensive situation. We are approaching the Cavit system now. Please hold your formation and do not adjust your defensive posture, and we will handle the approach. Another pause. We would also ask that the Wraith fleet master keep this channel open. We will have something to say to him shortly. The transmission ended. The orbital station was completely silent. Sial looked at her communications board. The frequency the transmission had come in on was listed in the board's deep historical database with a single notation: Human Standard Broadcast. Deprecated. Last verified, used 302 years prior. She said very quietly to no one in particular, they're not dead. On the bridge of his command vessel, Fleet Master Corps had heard the transmission too. His communication officer had already analyzed the frequency and the voice pattern and reported that it was of unknown origin. Corps had instructed him to analyze more carefully. The officer came back 30 seconds later and said the frequency matched pre-conclave human broadcast standards, and that the designation in the transmission United Earthship matched a classification type in a very old and very classified Wrath intelligence database that Corps had been briefed on exactly once many years ago and had not thought about since. He thought about it now. He had been told during that briefing that there was a region of space the Dominion had passed through 300 years ago. He had been told that the intelligence assessment of that region was unresolved, and that the Dominion's official position was that the species previously inhabiting it had been eliminated as a viable threat. He had not been told details. The briefing officer had moved on quickly. Unresolved, Core said to himself. Sir, his tactical officer asked. Run a deep scan of the area behind the Conclave fleet. Maximum range all spectrums. The tactical officer ran the scan. He looked at the results. He looked at them again. Then he looked at Core with an expression that Core had never seen on a Wrath officer's face before, because Wrath officers were trained not to show fear, and what was on his officer's face was very close to fear. Sir, the officer said, there are ships behind the Conclave formation, many ships. They were not on our sensors a moment ago. How many? Kayor asked the officer. Check the number 3 times. 412, he said. They are decloaking now. Velshan was watching the sensor relay feed from the archive on Conclave Prime. He saw the data the same moment as everyone else. He watched the mass signatures appear on the tactical display, one by one at first, then in groups, then all at once, blossoming into existence behind the Conclave fleet like something emerging from the dark. 412 ships, larger most of them than anything currently in the Conclave fleet, shaped differently, longer, more angular, with a design logic that was familiar from the archive images he had been studying for 2 weeks, but still strange to see in a live sensor feed. They came out of their cloak in perfect order, without any signal or command that the Conclave sensors could detect. They simply appeared, fully formed, as though they had been there all along, waiting for permission to exist. Velshan made a sound that his species did not have a word for. It was the sound of something inside him that had been held very tightly for 2 weeks, releasing all at once. He sat down on the archive floor because his legs were not working correctly, and he covered his face with his hands, and he made the sound again on every ship and station in the Kivit system. People were talking very loudly and very quickly. Orith's command channel lit up with calls from his captains, all asking variations of the same question. Seal was standing at her communications board with her hands flat on the surface, absolutely still, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors she had no names for. Into all of this, Fleetmaster Core opened the channel that Admiral Os Mensa had asked him to keep open. Core, because he was a thorough commander, and thoroughness sometimes meant doing things you did not want to do. Osai Mensa's voice came through clearly. Fleetmaster, you have absorbed 32 civilizations. You are expecting to absorb a 33rd. Today, I am contacting you to inform you that this will not happen. Core kept his voice level. You are 400 ships. We are 700. I have absorbed larger resistance forces than yours. You have not, she said simply, without argument, as though correcting a small factual error. You have absorbed species who were afraid to die for what they were protecting. I can tell you, as a matter of historical record, that we are not. I can also tell you that the ships currently decloaking behind you are not ours. They are the Conclave's. We released the cloak codes to them 3 minutes ago. Kor looked at his tactical officer. The officer was already staring at his display with the expression that was close to fear and was now considerably closer to the real thing. New mass signatures, the officer said, bearing. He stopped. He looked at the numbers again. Bearing directly behind us, sir, between us and the jump point, 80 ships. Conclave configuration, but the cloak signature is different. It's human cloak technology, Kor said, not a question. Yes, sir. The channel was still open. Osai Mensa had not said anything else. She was waiting. Kor looked at the display. He looked at the numbers. He was a thorough commander. He was doing the math. 700 Wraith ships against 400 human ships and 60 Conclave ships was a fight he would win. 700 Wraith ships against 400 human ships and 60 Conclave ships and 80 more ships he had not known about now positioned. Between him and the exit was a different calculation, and that was before accounting for what human weapons did, which was a variable he did not have reliable data on, and which he was, for the first time in a very long time, unwilling to simply assume was manageable. What do you want? He said. Into the channel. I want you to leave. Osmensa said, that is all. Take your fleet and leave the space and do not return. Do not return to any system in the Conclave. Do not return to any system in the region the Conclave calls the Outer Reach. Go. A pause. I will not offer this twice. Kor closed the channel. He looked at his display for 30 more seconds, running numbers, rechecking outcomes, doing what thorough commanders do. The numbers did not improve with examination. He turned to his navigator and said two words that he had never said before in his career, and that he would in private spend the rest of his life trying to explain to himself. Withdraw. Now. The Wrath did not leave. They pulled back 2 light minutes, enough to open a gap between themselves and the combined fleet, enough to give the impression that the withdrawal was happening. For 20 minutes. The sensor feeds showed them moving in the right direction. CL had started breathing normally again. 2 of Oreth's captains had opened congratulatory channels. Then the Wrath formation changed shape. It was not a retreat formation. It was something else. A compression, a folding inward, with a 700 ships pulling together into a dense mass that the Wrath's tactical systems had no designation for. It was new. He had been a commander for 30 years, and he knew what new looked like. New was dangerous. They're reorganizing, he said to his bridge crew. This is not a withdrawal. He opened a channel to the human flagship. Osmensa was already on it. We see it, she said. They are switching to close-range formation. They intend to push through us at short range, where the mass advantage matters more. It is a reasonable tactical choice given their numbers. Oreth looked at the display. Do we have a counter? Yes, she said, and closed the channel. What happened next Velson would later reconstruct from 17 different sensor feeds and 43 personal accounts, because no single source captured all of it. The Battle of Cabot system lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. What follows is what he found in those sources, assembled as carefully as he could manage. The human fleet moved first, not toward the Wrath mass, toward the edges of it. The 412 ships split into 8 groups and spread outward in a pattern that looked on the tactical display like opening fingers on a hand. Each group assigned itself to a section of the Vrath formation's perimeter. Orath watched and understood within 30 seconds what they were doing. They were not trying to stop the Vrath mass. They were trying to shape it, force it to respond to 8 directions. At once break the compression, prevent it from functioning as a single, organized push. They want us to hold the center. Orath said, keep the Vrath occupied at short range while the humans work the perimeter. His tactical officer asked quietly, can we hold the center? Orath looked at 61 ships against the dense middle of a Vrath formation that still numbered well over 500 vessels. He thought about the forward column that had been gone in 11 minutes 3 weeks ago. We hold, he said, move to engage. The first 3 minutes of the battle were the worst minutes Orath had experienced in 30 years of command. The Vrath weapons were unlike anything his crews had trained against. They did not fire in the way standard energy weapons fired. They pulsed rhythmically in sequences that seemed to anticipate where a ship was moving rather than where it was. 2 of his ships were hit in the first 60 seconds. Neither crew survived long enough to broadcast a distress call, but the Vrath were not firing only at a Wrath fleet. The 8 human groups had reached the edges of the formation and were doing something unexpected. They were not attacking the Vrath ships directly. They were attacking the space between the Vrath ships, the electromagnetic field that allowed the formation to coordinate, the communication web that let the 700 ships think together. The human weapons targeted the connections rather than the vessels, and the effect was visible on the tactical display. Within 90 seconds, the Vrath formation began to fragment, individual ships losing the coordination, signal responding more slowly, firing with less precision. The Orath saw a gap open in the center of the Vrath mass. Real gap, not a feint, a gap that led to the core of the formation. He ordered 2 of his ships to hold position and 3 to go through the gap. Sir, his tactical officer started 3 ships through the gap, Orath said. Now they went. Ensign Torin Vale was 19 years old and had been on a warship for 8 months and had never been in actual combat. His station was sensor monitoring on the 3rd deck of the UES Meridian, one of the 8 human ships in what the battle plan called Group 7. His job was to watch a display and call out anything unusual. He had been told during training that combat was mostly data and attention. He had believed this. He did not entirely believe it anymore. The Meridian shook when the first Vrath shot hit the hull on the port side, not catastrophically. The shields had absorbed most of it, but with enough force that he grabbed the edge of his station with both hands and held on until the shaking stopped. Around him, his crewmates were moving with a speed and certainty that surprised him, because most of them did not look calm, and yet they were all doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Lieutenant Curran, who was 24 and had been in combat once before, was calling out targeting coordinates in a voice that was tight but even. The weapons officer was firing in 2-second bursts, precise and controlled, walking the shot pattern along the communication nodes in the section of Wraith formation that Group 7 had been assigned. The captain, Commander Isut Faber, who was 41 and had the kind of face that expressed feelings only when she chose to let it, was watching 4 screens at once and saying nothing, which Vale had learned meant things were going more or less according to plan. A Wraith ship pulled out of formation and oriented toward the meridian. It was much larger than the meridian. Vale saw it on his display and thought very quickly and clearly that this was probably going to be the end of the mission and possibly his life, and he was surprised to find that what he felt was not exactly fear. It was more like a very strong focus, kind of a tension. Commander Faber looked at the Wraith ship. She looked at her display. She said, "Adjust bearing 14 degrees port, full thrust. We'll keep our left shoulder toward them." The meridian turned so that its left flank faced the Wraith ship rather than its front. Vale did not understand why until the Wraith fired a long pulse that hit the meridian on the left side hard enough to crack two of the secondary shield emitters and take out the lights on decks 4 through 6. The ship shook badly, but it didn't stop, and the weapons officer from the new angle had a clear line to the communication node that Group 7 had been working on, a node that the larger Wraith ship had just moved away from in its effort to attack the meridian. Commander Faber said quietly, "Fire." The node went down. The section of Wrath formation it had been supporting fractured into 7 uncoordinated ships, each now operating alone, or each now a separate problem instead of part of a single coordinated mass. Vell reported the fracture to the captain as data. His voice was steady. He was a little surprised that it was steady. He filed that away to think about later. Later he would think about it a great deal. The Wrath had a name for a point in a battle when the outcome becomes clear. Velshan found it in their language database in a tactical document. Varketh. It translated approximately as the visible moment, the point when a skilled commander could see with certainty which way the battle was going to resolve. Fleet Master Corps reached Varketh at 2 hours and 40 minutes into the Battle of Kava system. He had been trying to adapt since the engagement began. This was something Wrath commanders were trained for. The situation changes, you chain. With it you find the new solution. He had reorganized his formation twice. He had redirected his primary firepower toward the human flanking groups 4 times, trying to break the perimeter pressure. He had tried to use his mass advantage to push through the conclave center and create a line-breaking force. None of it had worked the way it should have. The conclave ships at the center were fewer than his forces there, but they were not leaving. They absorbed losses and closed gaps. When he destroyed 3, the remaining ones simply redistributed, covering more space, firing more often. They did not stop. He had expected them to stop. The human ships at the perimeter were worse. They did not fight in ways he could model. His tactical systems were designed to predict ship movement and anticipate attack patterns, and they worked by identifying what an enemy commander was trying to end countering it, but the human commanders seemed to be trying to achieve several things at once, shifting intent mid-engagement in ways that his systems flagged as pattern unclear. You could not anticipate a pattern that wasn't constant. And then there was the event at 2 hours and 20 minutes. The event that Core could not stop thinking about, that his mind kept returning to. The way a tongue returns to a broken tooth. A human ship, one of the medium-sized vessels in the group that had engaged his left flank, had been hit by 3 consecutive shots. Its shields were gone, its drive output had dropped to minimal. It was by any objective analysis no longer a combat-capable vessel. The crew of that ship had three options: attempt repairs, request rescue, or attempt emergency, jump to safety. They had done none of these things. Captain of that ship, Corps, had found the vessel's designation in the battle log. UES Bright Promise, Commander Hesse Aikenwell, had broadcast a single transmission on the Human Fleet Channel. Corps systems had intercepted and translated it in real time. Group 3 Bright Promise Primary. Systems out. We are positioning for a final strike run on Vareth carrier catch. 7 Do not cover us, stay on assignment, this is our choice. And then the Bright Promise, crippled, nearly powerless already, dying, had turned toward the largest ship in Corps' left flank carrier group and accelerated at maximum thrust. The ship took 40 seconds to cross the distance. Corps' carrier had fired everything it had at the Bright Promise. The shots hit and the ship came apart. And then what remained of it, the core, the drive section, still carrying enough momentum, hit the carrier's hull at the weakest point of the impact angle, and the carrier's magazine detonated, and the carrier was gone. Corps had stood on his bridge looking at the space where a ship he had built and crewed over many years had been, and he had experienced something he had very little framework for. The Bright Promise had been a crippled ship. It should have withdrawn. Any rational commander with a crippled ship withdrew. That was not courage, that was mathematics. You did not spend a crippled ship, you saved it, or you saved its crew, because either had future value, unless you were operating under a different calculation entirely. 3 of Corps' captains, watching from their positions in the formation. We had opened internal channels in the moments after he had listened to their transmissions. They were confused. They were asking each other what it meant. One of them, an experienced commander, someone Corps had worked with for a decade, had said in a voice that was trying to be analytical and not entirely succeeding, they regard losing a ship as an acceptable cost. I don't understand why they regard it as acceptable. Another captain had answered, because they believe they are going to win. They are not calculating whether they will survive this fight. They are calculating when the fight will be over. Corps had closed the channel. At 2 hours and 40 minutes he reached Varketh. The visible moment he could see clearly, and without self-deception, that the battle was not going to resolve in the Dominion's favor. He had more ships than his enemy, but he was not fighting a battle of numbers. He was fighting a battle of calculation, and his enemies were calculating in a way he could not match or predict. He gave the withdrawal order for that second time. This time he did not leave it open to interpretation. This time he used the emergency protocol that could not be countermanded, the one that said, "We are leaving now in this direction at this speed, and nothing that happens in the next 10 minutes changes that." The Wraith fleet pulled back, not cleanly, under pressure from the human perimeter groups, under fire from Oris' reorganized center with the 80 ships that had been blocking the jump point, now repositioning to let the Wraith through rather than forcing in engagement they hadn't been assigned. The humans let them go deliberately. They did not pursue. Kerr noticed this. He spent the entire withdrawal thinking about it. The battle ended in silence rather than Triumph, no one announced it. The last Wraith signature vanished from the long-range sensors, and then there was just the cuvette system, damaged ships, debris fields, the orbital station with its lights still on, the planet below still turning. Seal had watched the entire battle from the communications board, unable to do anything else. The surrender document still sitting on the desk beside her. When the last Wraith signature disappeared, she sat down on the floor because the chair was not close enough, and her legs decided on their own that they were done. For a moment, she sat on the floor of the communications room and looked at the surrender document, and then she picked it up very carefully with both hands and tore it in half, slowly all the way through. It felt important to do it slowly. On the sensor display above her, the 412 human ships were holding formation around the Conclave fleet, steady and patient, waiting to be told what came next. Seal thought they chose us. She did not know yet what that would mean, but she sat on the floor and held the two halves of the document she had worked so hard on and let herself feel something she had not allowed herself to feel in 2 weeks. She let herself feel like they might be all right. The days after a battle have their own weight. They are not like the days before. The days before have purpose, direction, the narrowing focus of something coming. The days after are different. The danger has moved and left behind everything it unsettled, and you have to work out what to put back where. In the Kiveth system, the work was enormous. Rescue teams moved between the debris fields looking for escape pods. Repair crews went out to ships that had been hit and were still holding air. The orbital station's medical bay ran without stopping for 60 hours. Seal coordinated the evacuation completion from the surface because the threat was gone, but the evacuation ships were already in transit, and it was simpler to finish than to recall them. Orith filed his battle report and his casualty figures, and then sat in his cabin for an hour without moving, which was how he dealt with numbers that were too large to process immediately. He had lost 14 ships, 683 crew members. He had known some of them by name. He filed the report, and then he sat quietly with the names for an hour, and then he went back to work. The human fleet held position at the edge of the system, not threatening, not demanding anything, simply present in the way that things are present unavoidably, fundamentally changing the shape of the space around them by existing in it. The Conclave Council met by a relay on the 4th day. It was a full session. All 11 species present, all the seats filled this time, all the interpreters running. The session was marked classified at the highest level, and the transcript was sealed immediately afterward. Vel Shah was not present at the session, but he had sources, and 2 of the council members spoke to him informally in the days following. One in, and he was a skilled enough archivist to piece together what had been said from what those members chose to share and what they conspicuously chose not to. The first part of the session had dealt with the Vrath, early intelligence from Conclave scouts. The Dominion's fleet was pulling back, not just from Kiveth but from its entire expansion front. 3 other civilizations that had been in the early stages of integration were reporting that the Vrath forces had withdrawn without explanation. This was, by any measure, extraordinary. It was also, as one council member had reportedly pointed out, not necessarily permanent. The second part of the session had dealt with the humans. This was the part Valjean pieced together most carefully, because it was the part that mattered most for what he believed was going to be a very important next chapter in the history he was responsible for keeping. The arithmetic that the council had been forced to confront was this: humanity had spent 300 years in silence. In that time, they had built 412 warships plus 80 more equipped with cloaking technology so advanced that Conclave sensors had not detected them until they chose to reveal themselves. This was not the work of a small, struggling civilization. This was the work of a civilization that had known what it was building toward, which meant they had been watching for 300 years in silence. They had been paying attention. The question the council had not been able to stop asking in various forms was, what else had they built? What else were they watching? Where were they exactly, and how many of them were there, and what did they want to? A juring military analyst had reportedly said in the plainest possible terms, "We are not safer now than we were before the battle. We have replaced a known predator with an unknown one, the wrath. At least we understand. Their goal was absorption. Their methods were brutal but legible. The humans, we do not know their goal. We do not know their methods. We know only that they are capable of extraordinary patience and that they chose to reveal themselves at a moment precisely calculated to produce maximum effect." There had been silence after this. Ambassador CL had then said something that Belchan wished he had been present to hear directly. Because both of his sources quoted it slightly differently, and he could not be certain of the exact words. What she had said in essence was this: the wrath had given them a choice between two kinds of fear, and they should be honest about what they were choosing between. Fear of the wrath was fear of being erased. Fear of humanity was fear of the unknown. These were not the same, and she would take the unknown over Erasha. No one had formally disagreed. Session had closed without a resolution, which was the council's way of saying that no one was ready to decide anything. Yet, Belchan thought this was probably the right answer for now. He requested a meeting with Admiral O.C. Mensa on the 5th day. He expected to wait a long time for the request to be processed. There were many more important people than him who wanted to speak to her. He heard back within 2 hours. Yes, she would see him aboard the Unconquered Sun if he was willing to make the transit. He was willing. The docking process was unlike anything he had experienced before. Human ships had a different internal logic. The corridors were narrower than Conclave standard. The lighting was slightly warmer, the gravity a fraction heavier. The crew members he passed were mostly young, and they looked at him with a curiosity that was entirely undisguised. They were not rude, they were simply interested in the way that people are interested when they have been separated from something for a long time and are seeing it again for the first time. Oh, he was taken to a room that had a long window on one wall showing open space. O.C. Mensa was already there, standing at the window. She turned when he came in. She was shorter than he had expected, not small, but not the towering figure that his mind had assembled from the records and the voice on the comm channel. She was a middle-aged human woman with close-cropped gray hair and dark eyes. That where he noticed, doing exactly what he was doing, cataloging carefully. She offered a greeting in conclave. Standard, which was grammatically correct and lightly accented. He responded in kind, and they sat down on opposite sides of a table. There was no food offered, no ritual exchange, just two people sitting down to talk, which he found after everything refreshing. "I want to ask you things directly," he said. "I'm a scholar and I find indirect conversation wasteful." "I find it wasteful too," she said. "Ask, what do humans want from the conclave?" She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. He recognized the difference. "Nothing specific," she said. "We did not come here for trade agreements or territorial arrangements. We came because the Vrath were doing something that we recognized and that we have a policy about stopping." "You recognize the pattern," he said. "Yes, because humans have done similar things." Another pause. This one was different. Heavier. "Yes," she said again. Velshan looked at his hands on the table. He had spent weeks reading about humans. He had read about the wars, the capacity for destruction, the inability to stop even when stopping was rational. He had also read about the other things, the rebuilding, the adaptation, the moments of extraordinary cooperation that emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. He had tried to hold both pictures at once and had not quite managed it, the way you cannot see both the vase and the faces in the old optical illusion at the same time. "Should we be afraid of you?" he asked. She did not look away from him. She did not smile or soften the question with body language. She sat with it for a moment, and he had the sense she was treating it with the respect it deserved. "Probably a little," she said. "We are not harmless. We have never been harmless, and I would not insult you by pretending otherwise. We are a species that has caused a great deal of damage in our history, to ourselves, to others. We carry that. It is not comfortable to carry, but," he said, "but we are not the same species that did those things," she said, "or we are the same biology, the same impulses. But we have been living with our own history for a very long time, and we have made choices about what we do with it. The capacity for what we were is still there. It does not go away. We decided to use it differently." "How?" he asked. She thought again. "We decided that the things we were most dangerous about, the persistence, the refusal to stop, the willingness to pay any cost, those were pointed in a direction for a long time that caused harm. We redirected them. We pointed them at things that needed protecting. Instead," she paused, "it is easier to explain than to do. It took a long time to do." Velshan looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "The captain of the Bright Promise." Something moved in Osai Mensah's face, tightening that was brief but visible. "Yes," she said, "she chose that outcome. She did." A pause. "It was her right to choose. We do not order that. We do not ask for it, but we do not forbid it either. When a crew decides together that it is the right thing." She looked at the table for a moment. Commander Aikenwell had been on that ship for 6 years, so had most of her crew. They made the calculation together. I have read the transcript of their internal channel in the last 40 seconds before they went. I will not share it, but they were not afraid. Velshan was quiet. He thought about the old Keth observer's line. They do not stop. He thought he understood it better now than he had when he first read it, what it was not. That humans could not stop, it was that they had decided at some level that was not always conscious and not always comfortable, what they would not stop for, and having decided that they were genuinely unstoppable in the pursuit of it, not because of some biological inability to feel fear, but because fear was simply not the largest thing in the calculation. One more question, he said. Go ahead. The 300 years of silence, the watching, the building. He looked at her directly. Were you waiting for us to need you, or were you waiting to see if we were worth helping? Ozymandias' expression was difficult to read, then very slightly something. It shifted, not quite a smile, but something adjacent. Yes, she said. He thought about that for the rest of the day. Back on Conclave Prime, Man Belshon sat in the archive and wrote his report. He wrote it carefully over 3 days. He covered what he had found, the human records, the Wrath records, the history of the 300 years of silence. He covered what had happened at Cavith. He covered his conversation with Ozymandias. He wrote his conclusions last. They were not simple conclusions because the situation was not simple. The conclave was going to have to build a relationship with a species that was genuinely powerful, genuinely unpredictable, and genuinely not something that existing frameworks covered well. There would be difficult conversations. There would be moments of fear on both sides. There would be, he suspected, times when the conclave would look at humanity's history and wonder if they had made a terrible mistake by allowing this relationship to develop. He wrote all of this. He was a scholar. He did not leave out the uncomfortable parts, and then at the end he wrote one more paragraph. It was not in standard academic form. His supervisor, when she eventually read the declassified version, would note in the margin that it was unusual tone for a formal report. He did not care. He wrote, "They are not safe. They were never safe, and I do not believe they will be safe, and I think anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you comfort rather than truth. But they chose us. They watched for 300 years, and they chose to come when we needed them. And they let the ones who hurt us leave, rather than destroying them when they could have. Aaron and I have spoken to their admiral, and I believe she told me the truth. We should be careful. We should always be careful. But I have decided that a species that chooses to point its capacity for destruction at the things that threaten the people it has decided to protect is not the same as a species that points it at whoever is in reach. I have decided that is a meaningful difference. I have decided that is enough." He filed the report as classified. It would stay classified for 50 years. Ensign Torrin Vale stood at the observation window on the 3rd deck of the UES Meridian and looked at the Cabot system star. It was yellow-orange and quiet, an ordinary star by most measures, the kind that you would find in 100 systems and not look at twice. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, only he did not have anywhere else to be. His shift was over. The ship was on standard watch. The repairs to decks 4 through 6 were mostly complete. He could have slept. He was still too tightly wounded to sleep. He thought about the battle. He thought about the bright promise. He thought about Commander Faber saying fire in that quiet voice, and the way the Wrath formation had fractured on his display, and the way his own voice had been steady when he reported the data, even. Though his hands had been very cold, he thought about what it meant to be human, which was something he had not spent much time thinking about before. It was like asking what it meant to breathe. You did not think about breathing, because it was simply what you did. But out here in a galaxy that had believed his species was gone, in a battle where something he had read about in history classes had become real, he found himself thinking about it with an intensity that surprised him. He was thinking about it when a light blinked outside the observation window. He focused one of the conclave ships. He thought it was Luvari by the soft blue running lights was passing at a close angle, close enough that he could see its hull clearly. As it passed, a panel light on its side blinked on off a short pattern, then a long one. He stared at it, then he understood. Morse code would have meant nothing to a Luvari crew, but the pattern was universal enough, and the intent was universal enough. It was a greeting, just a greeting. Someone on that ship had decided to say hello to the ship that had held beside them during the worst 4 hours either of them had ever experienced, and they were doing it with the only language they had in common, which was light. He went to the wall panel and found the external lights control. It took him a moment to remember the sequencer. Then he blinked back. On, off, on, off. Hello. The Luvari ship was already past, slipping away into the dark of the system. He watched its lights grow smaller. He stayed at the window a while longer. The star was still burning, ordinary, steady, the same color it had been when he first looked at it. The system around it was the same system it had been before the battle, with its 3 planets and its asteroid field and its orbital station with its lights on. It was the same, and then it was also not the same at all. He put his hand flat against the cold viewport glass and stood there for a while, feeling the hum of the ship through the metal, and thought that all of this was something worth protecting. He was still not sure he fully understood what humans were, but he thought he was starting to understand what they were for. That felt like enough for now.